I always thought working the night shift at the old asylum would be easy money. I mean, how hard could it be? Just keep an eye on a few patients who were supposedly harmless, make sure they didn't wander off, and collect my paycheck at the end of the week. Simple, right? Well, let me tell you about my first night on the job. As I stepped through the towering gates of the asylum, a chill ran down my spine. The building loomed over me like a silent sentinel, its windows dark and foreboding against the night sky. I could hear the faint sound of distant screams carried on the wind, sending shivers down my spine. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just nerves. Inside the asylum was a maze of dimly lit corridors and echoing hallways. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. My supervisor, a grizzled old man with a permanent scowl, showed me to my post and handed me a set of keys. "These are for the patient rooms," he growled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Make sure you lock them up tight. We don't want any of them getting out." I nodded, trying to hide my unease as he shuffled off into the darkness. Alone now, I made my rounds, checking each room and securing the locks. The patients inside were a motley crew of lost souls, their eyes vacant and hollow as they stared back at me from their beds. I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for them, trapped in this hellish place with no hope of escape. As the hours dragged on, my eyelids grew heavy and my mind began to wander. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, sending a shiver down my spine. Summoning all my courage, I crept towards the source of the noise, my hand trembling as I inserted the key into the lock. With a click, the door swung open, revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare. The patient inside was huddled in the corner, his fingers bloody and torn as he clawed at the walls with wild, frenzied eyes. I stumbled backwards, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the door handle. But before I could escape, the patient lunged at me with a guttural scream, his nails digging into my flesh like talons. I cried out in terror, scrambling to break free as he pinned me to the ground with inhuman strength. In that moment, I knew I was in over my head. The asylum was not just a place for the mentally ill. It was a breeding ground for madness and despair, a realm where nightmares roamed free and the line between reality and insanity blurred. And as I lay there, trapped in the grip of a madman, I realized that my first day on the job would also be my last. I recall vividly the night I was summoned for my inaugural shift as an overnight caregiver for Mrs. Edna, a 65-year-old woman grappling with developmental disabilities. Her daughter Sarah sought a caregiver with a medical background to provide assistance during her nocturnal shifts. Little did I realize that this fateful night would be my first and last encounter with the enigmatic Mrs. Edna. As dust settled and Sarah departed for her night shift, I was left alone with Mrs. Edna in her antiquated home. Sarah had introduced us earlier, her demeanor suggesting a mix of relief and trepidation at leaving her mother in my care. The ominous air surrounding the aging residence hinted at the trials that lay ahead. Around 9 p.m., as the world outside plunged into darkness, the stillness of the house was punctuated by the sound of Mrs. Edna's footsteps echoing from the upper floor. An unease settled over me as I called out to her, receiving no response save for the creaking of the staircase under her weight. The darkness seemed to swallow her presence as she retreated to her room, leaving me to grapple with my escalating anxiety. Hours passed, each one stretching into eternity, as I sat vigil in the dimly lit living room. The solitude was occasionally shattered by the faint echo of Mrs. Edna's movements, a haunting reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. Sarah had warned me of Mrs. Edna's nocturnal wanderings, yet nothing could have prepared me for the eerie ambiance that permeated the house. It was nearing midnight when I ventured into the kitchen, my nerves frayed from the relentless silence. The flickering light cast elongated shadows across the linoleum floor, heightening the sense of foreboding that enveloped me. It was then that I stumbled upon a chilling sight, Mrs. Edna standing amidst a shattered tableau, her eyes vacant and her presence unsettling. In her disoriented state, Mrs. Edna seemed to gaze past me, her gaze fixated on some unseen specter lurking in the shadows. With trembling hands, I attempted to coax her back to her room, the air thick with an unspoken dread that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. As the night wore on, a sense of profound unease settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The faintest sound would send shivers down my spine, each creak of the floorboards heralding the approach of some unseen terror. And then in the dead of night, as the witching hour loomed, I awoke to a scene straight from the depths of my darkest nightmares. There, in the dim glow of the moonlight, stood Mrs. Edna, her figure cast in shadow as she brandished a gleaming kitchen knife. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight as she advanced towards me, her eyes ablaze with an otherworldly intensity. In that moment, time seemed to stand still as I grappled with the realization that I was utterly alone in the presence of an enigmatic force beyond my comprehension. With a primal scream, I fled the confines of that accursed house, my heart pounding in my chest as I sought refuge in the safety of the night. It was only with the light of dawn that I dared to return, the memory of that harrowing night forever etched into the recesses of my mind. And though I never set foot in Mrs. Edna's house again, the specter of her presence lingered like a ghostly apparition, a reminder of the fragility of the human psyche in the face of unspeakable horrors. On my inaugural day at Green Thumb Landscaping, I found myself dispatched to a task that felt more like an initiation into the bizarre. Nestled in the outskirts of town, the job seemed destined to challenge my resolve from the get-go. The company, a tight-knit crew of Green Thumb workers, overseen by our discerning boss, had a knack for assigning duties that tested one's mettle. Thus, when the call came in about a backyard overrun by unruly weeds, I couldn't help but sense a foreboding tinge to the assignment. Driving up to the property, a gnawing sense of unease took hold. The house, a decrepit structure shrouded in neglect, exuded an eerie aura. Its peeling paint and boarded-up windows painted a picture of abandonment that sent a shiver down my spine. Approaching the door, I was greeted by a middle-aged man whose unsettling smile seemed to stretch too wide, casting a shadow of doubt over his intentions. His voice, a peculiar blend of softness and pitch, added to the surreal atmosphere that hung heavy in the air. Inside, the absence of furniture struck me as odd, a silent testament to the house's desolate state. Yet it was the man's chuckle, more akin to a nervous giggle, that set my nerves on edge. Setting up my equipment, I ventured into the garden only to feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. When I broached the topic of the water supply, the man's casual mention of the main valve being upstairs sent a chill down my spine. The distant sound of footsteps echoing from above shattered any semblance of calm, igniting a primal instinct to flee. With a quickened pulse, I made a hasty exit, my mind racing with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. Later investigations revealed the truth. The house stood abandoned, a mere shell of its former self, and the call that summoned me there, a twisted prank orchestrated by unseen hands. Relaying the unnerving encounter to the authorities served as a small comfort, a glimmer of hope that others would be spared from the unnerving ordeal that befell me. As for my tenure at Green Thumb Landscaping, it was marked by lingering memories of that surreal first day, a cautionary tale that reminded me to trust my instincts, no matter how unsettling the truth may be.